get out of town. You really think he's going to fight the deep state, that he's anti-establishment? No. He's pulling out the chair for Netanyahu. Why don't these Democratic consultants get it? Like, they also are sort of paid not to get it because all the answers are there in Zohran's run. He has significant, broad-based, and working-class support, the exact sort of people that the Democratic Party has been bleeding and bleeding and bleeding.
We have just mistaken a lot of what is today left politics. That's actually libertarian philosophy and libertarian policy.
Watching it live streamed every day and seeing the world do nothing to stop it has been eye-opening.
Welcome to Doomscroll. I'm your host, Joshua Citarella. My guest is Krystal Ball, a political commentator and a co-host of Breaking Points. I am in the short term very seriously committed to social democracy, and I think what that practically means is having an overwhelmingly large, broad coalition. It's an electoral victory. Anything else is kind of a LARP.
Yeah.
And having that majoritarian politics, an electoral majority, you are going to need people who are more than just left and more than just liberal. So one of the things that I'm very curious about, and I think is the problem to solve, is, as I asked you before, how many of those people in the right-wing populist camp can be won over to the left agenda? Like those decisive margins, in some cases, by some estimates, is 20%. That's the electoral majority.
Yeah.
What do you think the chances are of winning those people over?
Well, we have to define our terms, right? So, people who are hardcore MAGA, if you consider them right-wing populists, forget about it. It's not happening. I've tried. It's not happening. Yeah. Not in large numbers.
You would know. Yeah.
People who are like the Theo Von listener, who maybe are not particularly political. Like Trump won people who don't consume a lot of political media, right? They call them like low information voters. To me, that sounds sort of like derogative, but like people who are just kind of living their lives and are not
just normal people
super into politics.
Live and breathe the news cycle.
And there was a cultural shift where those people end up, by significant margins, voting for Trump. I think those people are up for grabs. And, what the demographics of that group look like, certainly young men are a part of that. Young women who shifted are a part of that. Latinos who shifted are a part of that. I think that's the group where you're not going to get there by, I'll be kind of like Trump and do like a little moderate fascist, like a little nicer fascism.
Medium fascist?
Right. I'm going to be a medium fascist.
Okay.
Like, I'm going to take a moderate position on genocide. How about that?
Right.
That is not going to be the way you win those people over. And we know that because that's not the way Trump won those people over. I mean, he was a force of nature. He was out there making, astonishing, outrageous, offensive comments and pushing relentlessly his worldview that your problems are the fault of women and trans people and cultural elites and immigrants. Like, that's the reason why you're in the position you're in. And meanwhile, Democrats were running around going like, we did a border hawk bill. Like, we're just as hateful and mean as Trump is. And how did that work? Right? It was an utter and complete disaster. Or running around with Liz Cheney and being like, actually, we could be war hawks too. Like the Republic, you guys like that stuff, right? Or, running around with Mark Cuban and we're going to be nice to the billionaires.
Right.
You have to present a forceful, in-your-face, unabashed, alternative worldview that makes sense to people. And I think if you do that, I think you win because their worldview is wrong. It's wrong, it's ugly, it's cruel, they're thoroughly incompetent. So even if you're like, in favor of a different immigration approach, you weren't looking for people to get like sent to CCOT and torture, like a gay hairdresser to be tortured indefinitely. Their worldview only has purchase because it hasn't been directly challenged. So I believe that, and this is part of why, I keep coming back to Zohran, but he's such a hopeful emblem for me. And I think a real kind of like trial case for what we're saying.
Right.
He didn't say, let me back off of my positions on BDS. Let me not say that I want to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu. He was like, no, if you're going to ask me these questions, I'm going to answer them forthrightly. Do I think Israel has a right to exist? As a state with equal rights. Like, I'm not playing your games. And that is appealing to people. It's appealing to anyone because it says, like, I actually have a principle. Yeah. I actually have a shred of integrity. I actually am willing to fight for something. So to me, that's the way that you win, by offering a worldview complete with an explanation of how things went wrong and who the villains are and who the heroes are. That's the way you fight these people, not by going like, we'll be halfway on the genocide. We'll be halfway on the fascism. We'll do a kinder, gentler version of that. And that, to me, is the war that's going on in the Democratic Party right now. The base knows where they are. They're unabashed, right? They are hardcore. Trump's a fascist. It's a genocide. Like, we're done fucking around. That's where the base is. This is a war that's playing out within the Democratic Party, and I think will be resolved in 2028. And I'm hopeful about it. I'm hopeful because there's such a political opening, even just if you're talking about Israel, for someone to come in and say, it's a genocide and we're going to do everything we can to stop it, and we are never going to do this again. There is no potential 2028 Democratic candidate who has fully embraced that lane. And that is so crazy to me because I do think Israel is sort of like being anti-Israel is sort of like the punk rock thing that people feel like it's forbidden to say. And you gain so much credibility as someone who just has any shred of integrity and isn't fully and completely bought and for sale by just being honest about what we all can see every single day, the horrors we see every single day live streamed in our feeds.
To what degree does an online audience indicate a real-world political coalition?
It's a very interesting question and one that I've gone back and forth on. As I'm, Rising with me and Sagar at the Hill starts in 2018. We're big at covering the Democratic primary, Bernie, like all that stuff. And at that point, I was very hopeful that the enthusiasm we saw online meant a real world thing. And it did to a certain extent, but not to the extent that I wanted it to, right? Then, and Biden is able to win by sort of just ignoring the online world and using power politics and, behind the scenes and getting everybody to drop down, getting the media to help him and Obama.
Like a tiny margin, but
he does it, right? So then I kind of maybe overcorrect and I'm like, all right, well, maybe this doesn't really mean what I thought it meant at all. Then you have Trump come in 2024 and he's leaning heavily into this podcast circuit and, it's Rogan and Andrew Schultz and Theo Von and all these guys. And I'm like, yeah, sure. Online, I mean, is this real? Is this really real life? And I think I underestimated how much it represented something real that was happening, a real coalition that was forming. I would say the same thing with RFK Jr., where when he dropped out and ends up endorsing Trump, I really didn't think it was going to be that significant, but it did end up being. I think his influence really did end up being significant. And he certainly had a big online presence that was not at all reflected in the mainstream media. So, perhaps the online, I think now has become real life. I mean, I think it has subsumed reality and, not to a full and complete extent, but I no longer feel like you can look at things that are happening online and just be like, oh, well, that's just, this niche group that's just overly active online. Now, the caveat I would say is given how many bots are out there, driving the conversation, talking to one another, it makes it very difficult to estimate. But it's why, for example, I don't think you can dismiss someone like Nick Fuentes, who is, experiencing this surge in popularity right now, as just an online persona who has a niche audience that you shouldn't pay attention to. I feel like I've sort of learned that lesson of, no, this is a real thing, and he's having a real influence, and this could be a big problem for the future.
I mean, that was great. You went through a bunch of my follow-ups. So
that means I talked too long. Sorry.
No, it's great. It's just, I think you understood the thread I was trying to bring us through. One of the uphill battles of doing this project, I used to do some consulting before this for largely advertisers, but that data spills over into all these different groups. And I think I'm breaking an NDA by doing this, I'm not sure, but I won't say the name of the company.
Okay.
They were doing this project called, get this, Breaking Points, in which it was about political narratives disrupting consumer habits.
Should I sue them?
Think about, the great irony is they were trying to explain things like, for example, Nike or Bud Light, or there's some political controversy in a commercial, and then consumer habits go the opposite direction for a while. And they were talking about how is there going to be any form of consensus in a world of echo chambers and whatever? And I was like, well, you should probably check out this news program called Breaking Points, which they didn't know about. They didn't know about. So my question
That's
is
funny.
like, why is it so fucking hard for consultants, not just the private sector one, but like Democratic Party consultants, elites of any shape or form, to take stuff that happens on the internet seriously?
I mean, I think it just comes down to them being kind of behind the times and out of touch. They still are very much in the mental model of what matters is like what's on the nightly news and in the newspaper. And I think there's a bit of snobbery around it as well, you know, where when we talked, I know you interviewed Andrew Callahan, had a great interview with him. We talked to him as well. And he was so disgusted with the way that after he had this incredible Hunter Biden interview, the press called him an RV YouTuber. That's how they described him. And he's like, I mean, that sounds kind of cool, but why can't you just call me a journalist? How about that?
Quantitatively the largest documentarian of our generation.
Yeah, he's like, I
RV
went to
YouTuber.
school for journalism.
Yeah.
The bottom was falling out of the industry when I graduated. And so I wanted to do like a Vice thing. And I had no choice but to do it on my own. And now you're going to call me an RV YouTuber. And this is a guy who's like, intentionally got himself arrested by ICE to know what that process is like. Like if anyone deserves the mantle of journalist, I would say someone who's willing to do those things certainly earns it. And so there's also just a level of snobbery of like, well, these people didn't get the credential or they didn't go through the path or they don't have the whatever signifier of serious person that, I think is what's merited. It's certainly a generational thing. And, within both parties, but in particular in the Democratic Party, there is a massive issue with, a gerontocracy that just won't let go and has no understanding of what's happening online, can't relate to it, doesn't understand it. I mean, look, I get it too. I mean, I'm 43 years old. I have tried to I did some TikToks, they did okay, but I'm not a TikTok person, so I don't really get the medium. And I'm sure whatever comes after that, I'm going to get even less. So I kind of get it on some level. But, I think they're themselves out of touch, disconnected. And then there's just this snobbery and disdain, especially because a lot of the fiercest criticism of the Democratic Party from within, the quote unquote coalition came from the left, came from those online YouTube shows. And so they would love to just pretend like we're not important and don't exist.
Yeah. Yeah. The next time we have Andrew back, I'm going to introduce him as Andrew Callahan, RV YouTuber. Yeah. A few years ago, you co-authored a book with your co-host from Breaking Points, Sagar and Jetty, The Populist Guide to 2020, which, quote, underscores above all that the old ways of looking at politics as conventionally liberal and conservative are no longer useful. What are the new ways of looking at politics, and what polls are useful today?
Probably one of the lenses that is useful to understand the shifts in the electorate is the sense of being pro-system or anti-system.
Right.
And I think there is a deep sense of uncertainty, a deep level of disgust, a deep level of mistrust with the institutions of the country, whether that's media institutions, government institutions, corporate institutions, et cetera. And so, you are going to get a long way with the population, even if you're just willing to point to those things. And Trump was able to point to those things, but then he himself is the system. He points to maybe the right problem and then he just makes everything absolutely worse. So I think that's one of the lenses. And I do think we're at kind of an interesting moment of obvious current day horror and potential future possibility where I am quite convinced that we aren't going to be going back to some abundance style, rebranded neoliberalism. I think you have some sort of more radical politics on the table. Yeah. Whether that is, an even more fascist direction on the right. I think that's a possibility. The sort of Fuentes direction for the right, which seems to be quite ascendant and I think is influential. I think people need to pay attention to. Or it's more of a Zohran model because you've had the Democratic base really radicalized in this moment in a way that they weren't previously, I do think there's a larger possibility for that avenue than there was previously.
There's a hard break to the right or the left, right? The center is untenable. I was going to ask this later, but what comes after neoliberalism?
It's one of those two things. For me, the conflict over deprogramming or shifts, however you want to call it, on Israel, I really do think it is central to our politics in a way, even though I know if you asked most of the population, they wouldn't be like, that's my number one issue. Mm-hmm. But I think it's really central in sort of breaking apart and exposing the hypocrisy of the leadership of both of the parties. Because on the Democratic side, you've got people who claim they care about international law and humanitarianism and territorial integrity, and then there you are supporting a genocide.
Right.
And on the right, and I see this certainly through my conversations with my co-host Sagar, you have a movement that claimed to be all about American interests, America first. And then you have all these politicians like on their congressional resource break, right? They're like, instead of going home and talking to our constituents, we're going to Israel to meet with Netanyahu while he's announcing his next war crime. Yeah. So I think it really has sort of broken open both parties in a certain way. Yeah. And that's why I say that, I know you talk a lot on the show about like, what is punk rock, or why did the right become punk rock, or, what does that look like now? And I sort of feel like being hating Israel is kind of punk rock right now. And that can lead you in two different directions. Yeah. One is Nick Fuentes. Mm-hmm. And there are way too many people out there who are looking at his outright white nationalist Nazi self and going, you know what? He was right about the Jews. Yeah. Of course, that's outrageous. It's racist. He is not, in fact, right about the Jews. But there's a lot of people who are looking at that and saying, oh, this is making sense to me. And on the other hand, you have the left, which has long had a grounded humanity-first critique of Israel as an apartheid state and, certainly post-October 7th, an apartheid state committing a genocide. And that also is making a lot of sense to people and is causing people to, ask a lot of important questions about what they've been sold from political leadership in general. And so that's why I feel like, in a certain sense, even though, again, I know that people wouldn't say like, oh, this is my number one issue, but I think it is sort of a key to unlocking what the future of both of these parties could look like and what sort of tracks are open for the country going forward.
Well, it was certainly hard to go through, October 8th onward after 8 years of woke and talking about settler colonialism as like there's violence in the literal settlements, right? Like it just broke a lot of narratives. And then the right-wing free speech stuff, all of a sudden that disappears because now you can't say shit about Israel.
Right.
So it's just like everything is kind of thrown up in the air, and that was the landscape. And now it's like, we're fighting it out again.
Yeah.
On this topic of punk rock, one of the reasons I asked that question, no one has gotten it right yet.
Oh, well,
so
what's
Catherine
the right? Tell us.
Catherine Liu and I privately know what the correct answer is. So punk rock was itself a rebellion against the disciplined, organized trade unions of the time. And it was not a left-wing rebellion. It was a libertarian rebellion against trade unionism. And for whatever reason, I think probably due our cultural indebtedness to the 68 generation, we have just mistaken a lot of what is today left politics. That's actually libertarian philosophy and libertarian policy. And so one of the reasons I ask that is because, if the counterculture was really left-wing in a meaningful sense, how could it have been co-opted? The answer is it was never actually left-wing. And that explains, punk rock. It explains how Dime Square is, reactionary, but also transgressive. Yeah. It explains Vice magazine. It explains Gavin McGinnis to the Proud Boys. Mm-hmm. All of that stuff was implicitly libertarian. It's a lot easier to move libertarians over to the far right.
Yeah. I think that's very interesting.
I gave up the whole game now. The show's over.
Yeah, that's it. Sorry. Okay. I'm glad you gave me the answer so I could cheat on the test, though.
Well, you brought up Robert Putnam on a show recently, and I wanted to ask you about the 68 counterculture. Yeah. What do you think the legacy of that counterculture is?
Well, I think you nailed some important pieces of it. And I think a lot about the parallels with the 70s and this moment, because I think there did start, there was a genuine movement of like, oh, we can participate in politics, we can make a difference together. We have, the civil rights movement, we have these, union movements and the anti-war movement. And then when you have this series of assassinations and you have the counterculture like co-opted by capitalists and like we're going to use it to sell Coca-Cola or whatever, and you have the election of Richard Nixon, you have this real retrenchment where there's a sense of people kind of giving up on the collective project. And then you get the back to the land movement.
Right.
And
Right.
people like, all right, well, I'm going to individually go and like on my commune, we're going to figure out how to live in a better way together. And, but in this very sort of individualized commune by commune kind of a way. And it's a retreat from the political system. And I think that there are a lot of echoes of that moment in the current moment that does lead to Donald Trump, Trump's reelection, where you have the Bernie movement and there's the sense of possibility of we're going to get Medicare for all. We're going to truly change this country. We're going to go in a different direction. We're going to take over the Democratic Party. Like it's going to be, we're going to make sure people can live and have wages and have unions and healthcare, and it's going to be great. And then that crashes into the rocks of the Democratic establishment, and also crashes into the rocks of just like where the public was at that point. At that point, the liberal base isn't radicalized. They like the policies, but they're also very much, MSNBC liberals, where when they say, hey, you got to vote for Hillary Clinton or you got to vote for Joe Biden, they're like, okay, that's what we're going to do if that's what's going to defeat Donald Trump. And so, I watched as, especially after Bernie 2020 fails and is destroyed, there's this sense of nihilism that takes hold. There's a retrenchment. And then it's what comes naturally out of that is like, I'm going to focus on myself, what I can do, my own freedoms and liberties to like say retard or pussy or whatever, and not being put upon by the man or these woke scolds. I'm gonna go to the gym. I'm gonna get fit. I'm gonna do these things for myself. There's nothing wrong with that, by the way. That focus on the pieces of your life that you have autonomy and control over, I think actually is a very beautiful thing, a testament to the human spirit. But if you have that and you give up on the collective, I think it's a very easy way to end up in, some of the spaces that have developed, whether it's the manosphere, whether it's Trump's reelection, like this sort of, I'm in it for myself and I'm going to get what I can for myself. Crypto, obviously, is another, the financial version of that, where it's like, well, this legacy financial system has failed you and you can't get ahead. You can't buy that house. Well, here's this secret insider trick that, you're going to be able to get rich. And again, it's an individual activity. It's all about your boldness and seizing the day and this sort of rhetoric that's sold with it. So I think those things, to me, they all sort of go together. And, from what I've read about that time period in the 70s, I do see a lot of echoes.
Yeah. As long as we're going out of order here, I promise I will eventually let this go. But my libertarian autism is just, I'm stuck on this question of the 1970s. New Deal liberalism, social democracy. These are, in some arguments, questions of teleology, that in the development of liberalism, these are different phases that it moves through. Neoliberalism was not just contingent. It wasn't just temporary victory on behalf of the capitalist class. It was a developmental necessity that through declining rates of profits and levels of development, you just move towards privatization. There's another argument that's rearing its head now, where a lot of these systems that neoliberals have designed, encasing everything into markets, have become less efficient than just the universal basic services. That is actually, this is where the terminology gets very slippery. That is an austerity argument against neoliberal policies. Now, what I just said sounds totally counterintuitive, but it is more cost effective to plan or to implement universal basic policies than it is to have markets. There is some window in there where through the lens of austerity, you can again restore some semblance of social democracy. Interesting.
I haven't thought it through, and I would have to think it through a bit more. But you're basically saying like there's a Doge version, there's a like better version of Doge. Back to social democracy is kind of the idea. Like, for example, to just sort of think out loud about what you're saying. Zohran versus Cuomo in New York, you've got Zohran doing the like, we're just gonna freeze the rent, like across the, for rent stabilized apartments across the board. It's more of a universal policy, even though we understand that not everybody's living in a rent stabilized apartment. Cuomo comes out with this like convoluted Zohran's law means tested, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, how does this, like, this is less efficient
Pell
than
Grant
just
recipient, small
yeah,
business.
or I saw Alyssa Slotkin put out some like, if your business isn't paying enough for workers to, you know, not be on federal support, then we're going to take your tax credits. Or again, it's this kind. It's like, why don't they just pay more? You know, pay a higher wage? Why don't you just mandate a higher wage or a union rather than all of this like piecemeal, complicated neoliberalism that doesn't make any sense? Or in the Trump version, you know, the adding of the work requirements to Medicaid, we know what that's all about. It's not going to save money. It's just going to make it so that fewer people have health care. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think the best, like, most expedient example of this is that, like, when you implement a means-tested policy, many times the salary costs of the people who do the means testing, the administrative work, extends past the cost saving from the policy in general.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, we lost money while trying to save money. It doesn't actually make any sense.
I mean, I think it's correct. I think what you're saying is obviously correct. If you just look at, you know, even if you look at our healthcare system versus other developed nations where they spend less, have universal healthcare, and get better results.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that it's an argument. I'm not sure it's the best argument for the left to make, though, because it's not an area where the left has particular credibility of being like the spendthrifts, you know? And it's also, I think, hard to get past a short-term mindset of like, at the outset, you're going to spend more, but you're going to save more because of the reduction in the complexity of the programs. It's just a bit of a complicated argument to make and requires trust for people to buy into that I'm not sure is there. Like a long-term thinking of like, well, this is going to save us money in the long run. I also just don't know that people are that motivated by the government saving money. You know, I think they're more motivated by like, are my kids going to get to go to a good school? Yeah, is the neighborhood going to be safe and clean? Am I going to have a home I can live in that's mine, that, you know, is going to help me have a level to get past this precarity that I'm feeling every day? I think speaking to those is probably a more appealing pitch.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that infamous Koch brothers study that was like, how much is Medicare for all going to cost? And it turns out that it saves something like $3 trillion over 10 years. And it's like,
they accidentally revealed
just
that.
Like,
they're like, well, never mind.
It headed off the debate in such a way where it's like, well, actually, you can't make that argument that it's too expensive now because it's cost savings.
Yeah.
But
it just, it almost feels like making a sort of like technocratic neoliberal argument in service of leftist values. And I don't think it lands emotionally.
My primary ideological affiliation is trolling. So I love it. On this question of healthcare, what is the right-wing populist solution to the crisis of American healthcare?
There isn't one. There isn't one.
I can see like, okay, anti-war with Iran, you know, left-wing populism, right-wing populism, sure. What are they going to do about healthcare?
Well, I mean, look at MAHA. It's a mess, right? What they're going to do is, instead of high fructose corn syrup in your Coke, and Sagar has been on them on this, so I'm stealing from him. Full credit to Sagar on this. Instead of that, we're going to have cane sugar in the Coke. Like, aren't we all healthier now? Yeah. It's a libertarian approach to healthcare. Yeah. It's like, we're going to pump you up to go to the gym yourself. Where you have to pay a membership. We're not building the gyms, the public gyms, right? You have to go out and buy the membership and, you know, do that. We're certainly not going to be able to provide you with Ozempic. That's not happening. But, you know, maybe we'll like kind of pressure a company or two to take some like artificial dyes out of their cereal or switch to beef tallow in the French fries. Yeah. It's a very libertarian approach where ultimately the shame and the responsibility for your health is put directly onto you. I think that's primarily the direction that they've gone in since MAHA has become a part of the Trump coalition.
That's what's so curious about it is that like the Reagan program of responsibilization has just been like, Trump is this anti-neoliberal right-winger, whatever. They're just doing responsibilization to everything. Like that is their entire program, seemingly.
Yeah. And like I said, I think because there's this sense of nihilism and lack of belief that we could do anything better collectively together, it ends up being an appealing pitch to people. And I don't want to take people's agency away. I think it's good that people, things that they have control over in their life, that they, that they do that. I was actually just watching before I came over here. Have you seen there's been a couple of these gym bro guys who have done interviews with this gym rat in Gaza?
Oh, yes, I have seen this.
There
yeah.
are two that I've seen now who have done this. And I find this guy in Gaza who's, can barely get a meal every single day. His house was bombed and destroyed, and he's working out in the rubble using doing pull-ups on rebar or whatever. I find it so inspiring that what a testament to the human spirit that even in the face of a genocide where people he loves are being murdered, where he's being starved, where he's seeing just untold human suffering every single day, he's still sort of finding his own way to take back a part of his life and make himself feel human. And I think it's beautiful that these two guys decided to have him on, just because it's sort of a radical thing, just unfortunately, to make Palestinians be human. But anyway, that's just a long way of saying, I think having that agency over your life is actually a profoundly beautiful thing. But if you only have these individual, you're going to work out and you're going to not eat this and you're going to, watch your macros or whatever the thing is, and, that is the political project in and of itself, yeah, it's not going to actually improve the outcomes for the country. And RFK Jr., I interviewed him multiple times, very contentious interviews on every occasion. And he used to be on the left. And so I asked him, well, how can you say you care about health so much if you're not talking about healthcare, if you're not talking about Medicare for all? And it became quite clear, I don't remember exactly how he answered it, but it became quite clear to me that his focus was more on this just very libertarian direction. And that's how you can have MAHA seemingly coexisting with I think the ag secretary was a seed oil lobbyist, and they're doing all sorts of things to allow more pesticides in the growing process and to free up the hand for toxic forever chemicals. It's these things don't make any sense together if you actually care about health, not to mention the stripping away of healthcare of millions of people, which has been, the sort of central accomplishment of this administration.
Yeah. I mean, he's chasing every meme that you see on Twitter, methylene blue and all this stuff.
I haven't even gone that deep on it.
I've been trying it. It doesn't work very well. I had to do a podcast.
Try it?
Well, I had to do a podcast, and I was I'm really fucking tired. I didn't get enough sleep. So I had coffee, and I was well, I've got this stuff. Maybe I should try it. And the last minute, they fucking sprung it on me. It was a video podcast. I was scrubbing my tongue, brushing my teeth furiously to try and get It didn't really, it was less than Adderall. Maybe I didn't take enough, but
So you felt some impact from it?
About the same as a cup of coffee.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
I turned my tongue blue.
I didn't even know that energy was what it was supposed to do. I just knew it was a weird thing that had taken off.
It's like a nootropic concentration kind of thing. I honestly didn't look too deep into it. I just saw a meme and I thought I'll try this on myself.
What's the worst that could happen?
Exactly.
I'll end up with a blue tongue on a podcast.
Blue. Yeah. On today's social media, it's very clear how Gen Z people get politicized. Previous to this podcast, I did a series of interviews, written, audio, published it in a book. Young people find memes, they find videos, they find podcasts because all of reality, politics, is just pushing itself into the forefront of sports and every other vertical, to use a legacy media term.
Yeah.
How did you get politicized?
I would say for me, it was a multi-step process. It was certainly the Iraq War was my first big political awakening. I was opposed. And, I was on the moveon.org email list. And that was my first real political activation. And I was devastated when George W. Bush wins re-election in 2004. And I think the other point of real politicalization for me was actually becoming a mom and really feeling this sense of stake in the country's future. I guess it dovetails with what we were talking about the individual versus the collective, because for me, having a child really made me think more about the collective and what this project was going to look like. And specifically, this is sounds sort of small ball, but it was that opening question of begins the political journey. I was shopping for baby bottles, and I realized there was some chemical that was allowed in baby bottles in the U.S. that's banned in Europe.
Yep.
and you had to be educated.
Reprotoxic.
Yeah, you had to, exactly. You had to be educated. This sounds very MAHA, by the way, before you went to buy a baby bottle.
Right.
And I started thinking, like, how the hell does that happen? And then you think of, it's like, oh, well, here's how it happens. There's some plastic lobby or that chemical lobby or whatever, and they buy a politician, and there's, they decide that it's more important to get this check from whatever this thing is than to actually make sure that you can just buy a safe baby bottle. And when you start to really think about that throughout the political system, that was the beginning for me of a real awakening. The other piece that I would mention as being very influential for me in terms of the specific brand of my politics is I lived in a town, it's called East Liverpool. It's actually very close to East Palestine in Ohio. Yeah. It's right at the intersection of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia all like come together right there. And it's been completely left behind. This is an area, East Liverpool was famous for it's where all the like plates and cups and dishes were made. It had all these potteries, like 200 potteries in this area. That kind of starts going overseas in like the 50s. There was a big steel mill next door in Beaver, Pennsylvania, and that goes, is decimated 80s, and then you've got NAFTA. And so this whole area, just town after town after town, up and down the Ohio River Valley, you see you see devastation, you see economic devastation. And so that really influenced me in terms of my view on labor and NAFTA and trade policy. And that's what sort of pushes me off in that particular direction.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the historical memory of like what the U.S. was like before and after NAFTA. I had this conversation with Amber as I think episode 7 or something like that. But she brings up this really good point of like, we have this kind of knee-jerk reflex of saying like, well, things are really bad right now, but, this younger generation, they're more radical than ever. They're going to take care of it. And you're just putting like totally unqualified young people in charge of things. And what Amber says, and also she talks about in her book, is that she had to talk to older people who have the memory of what organized labor was like and what neoliberalism was like. And actually the last thing you should be doing is putting your political hopes in young people, because there was a better, more prosperous era of the United States, which is a few decades behind us. But the Gen Z people don't particularly have the answers.
I think the ideal is that you have the younger generation, and I think Bernie's an important bridge for this, right? Connecting with the best parts of that legacy from the past, because we also don't want to overly romanticize it, but also have their eyes open for a new flavor of whatever that looks like and however it expresses itself and makes sense in, an America that's very different from how it was during the New Deal era. So I don't know. I'm not that optimistic about where we are as a country in the world, but it's not because I think that Gen Z, isn't up to the task. I think between the rise of fascism globally and certainly here in the U.S., the climate crisis, which is, spiraling and escalating every single year, and what I see as an existential threat on multiple fronts of AI, and I sort of tie AI in with the oligarchic concentration in general. Yeah. I think there's just some really big challenges.
On this topic of young people, how do you explain some of these historic shifts towards the Republican Party?
I think it's just discussed with the status quo.
The Democrats are the status quo.
Both political parties are the status quo.
Trump, I see. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, Trump is a liar and a con man and positioned himself as being a threat to the status quo, which was absolute and complete bullshit. And I think there's been a real awakening with that. I mean, there was a lot of celebratory, like, oh my God, Gen Z has shifted so much to the right after the election. Those gains are already gone. Young men have shifted away from Trump faster than any other demographic group. And I don't think there's any Republican Party figure on the horizon who has nearly the potential, like, cultural appeal of Trump. Like, I don't think J.D. Vance is going to be able to pull that off. Marco Rubio, Don Jr.
I don't think so.
Yeah. And I don't want to downplay, like, I think J.D. Vance is a scary person in his own right. But it sort of reminded me of after Obama wins in 2008 and again in 2012, Democrats have this sense of triumphalism of, like, the coalition of the ascendant, young people are with us, minorities are with us, it's going to be like this forever. And then, boom, it turns out the Obama coalition is only for Obama. Yeah. And I think that there's kind of a similar thing going on the right now, where there's a unique appeal of Trump being upset economically, of the, backlash to Me Too, backlash to the George Floyd protests, like the wokeism, whatever, this confluence of events creates this moment. And again, I think the Gaza genocide truly is an important part of that as well, because it layers another level of just moral outrage and disgust at the Democratic Party leadership. But I don't see that as a durable shift. And like I said, I think we've already seen it evaporate and go away. Now, my fear is that instead of the younger generation, young men in particular, being enlisted in an actual collective project capable of creating progress in the country, that instead there's just a slip into nihilism. And I think that's probably the most likely outcome, but I don't think it's an inevitable outcome. But in terms of them just being Republicans for life, I think we've already seen that that's kind of evaporated.
To watch part 2 of this episode, you can support the show on Patreon. Why is the Democratic Party less responsive to the popular will than the Republican Party?
I'm not sure that they are. I think they're definitely less responsive to their base than the Republicans. And I would say it comes still out of the Bill Clinton era, where his political innovation was, we're going to triangulate, we're going to punch left. That's the way that I'm going to be able to signal that I'm this moderate character, that I'm this, everyman who's willing to have my sister soldier moment, et cetera. And I think the Democratic Party has just continued to operate on that trajectory ever since of the way to appeal to this mythical moderate voter is to constantly be bashing whoever the left is in the party. And it comes out of just a reflex and an instinct. And then there's also a reality there, of course, where the Democratic leadership is in league with, corporate donors and extremely wealthy people who genuinely also do despise progressives and the left. So since you have a class analysis on the left, that's never going to sit easily with a party that, gets most of their donations and socializes and sees themselves as part of this financial elite. On the Republican side, since there isn't as much of a class analysis with the base, it doesn't cost them as much with their donors to do the things that the base wants them to do and to overserve their own base. So I think that's a big part of the dynamic.
This conflict between the base and the donors, there's a shifting base of the Democratic Party where maybe in the 1970s, my parents' generation, there was much more of a labor constituency. And now the base of the Democratic Party is urban professionals or something like this.
Yeah.
The donors have also shifted. Which one of those came first?
It was, again, I think a deliberate strategy of the Clinton era in particular. I mean, it starts under Jimmy Carter. You start to have this neoliberal shift. Then you increasingly have these Supreme Court decisions that open the floodgates of money. And it really is Bill Clinton who says, you know what, I can play this game too. And he explicitly says, we are going to win these young urban professionals. Union busting is going on across the board, led by the Republicans, but sometimes also embraced by Democrats and not fought back against by the Democrats as they abandon the New Deal coalition. So the two things really do go hand in glove. And I think that decline of labor unions is probably the most salient point of why you've seen this shift of working class voters away from the Democratic Party and toward the Republican Party. Because still today, if you look at union members, it's one of the biggest predictabilities of whether or not they're going to vote Democratic. So even as union members have shifted somewhat to the right, it's still a huge indicator of Democratic support. And so as that sort of class-based, solidarity-based movement has declined under attack from forces across the board, again, led by the Republicans because they saw it as a threat to their own power base, I think that has really caused a massive problem for Democrats in terms of being able to appeal to the working class. And of course, their own actions have not exactly helped there in many instances.
Yeah, there's this statistic is out of date, but a few years ago, I remember looking up how many people actually work in tech. And I think in the totality of the United States, 1.9% of the population worked in tech.
Yeah.
2.1% of the population was farmers. So imagine pursuing a Democratic majority that consists of less than 2% of the population. It seems very, very untenable.
Yeah. Although I would say, the lines between white-collar professionals and working class, sort of the traditional blue-collar working class or the service sector working class, they're becoming increasingly blurry because as you have this massive wealth consolidation at the top, it becomes more and more difficult for people who did, went to college and took on all the debt and, did the thing they were supposed to do and are working the desk job. It becomes increasingly difficult for them to afford health insurance, afford to send their kids to college, certainly afford to buy a house. And so, the precarity is coming for almost everyone. And certainly AI is accelerating all of that. And we're already seeing this in terms of the amount of college graduates who are struggling to find employment. Again, having quote unquote done the right thing, like in terms of the neoliberal era bargain of like, well, we're going to take away your pension, we're going to take away the unions. But if you work hard and you go to college and you take out the debt, there's going to be this college wage premium on the other side. And especially for millennials and Gen Z, that's just not the case anymore. That deal it's turned into a complete betrayal.
Yeah, I believe lifetime earnings with a college degree are still a bit higher, but
there's still a premium
recently,
for sure.
The unemployment rates for people with a college degree is now higher than those without.
Wow.
There's a really big indicator.
Yeah.
Don't quote me on that. I saw it from a meme account on Twitter, but I trust it for some reason.
I've definitely seen numbers that the unemployment rate for college graduates is spiking.
Yep.
And there may be a number of reasons for that. The tariffs I'm sure don't help because there's just this sense of uncertainty. And so businesses are kind of like, let's just hold in place. But there's no doubt that AI is a part of that because the first jobs that you could automate out of existence would be those entry level, Excel spreadsheet jockey type positions that many of us cut our teeth on. And it makes sense that those would be the first to go.
Yeah, the Zoomers I talk to, they say learn to weld. That's actually the best way to pursue the labor market right now. We're in the first year of the Trump administration. In what ways has Trump governed as a populist?
Occasionally rhetorically. I think that's about it. I mean, I've always thought that was the case with Trump. Like, look at his first administration. The biggest accomplishment is this giant tax cut for the rich. And now his biggest accomplishment is, quote unquote accomplishment, is re-upping that tax cut for the rich, paid for by stripping healthcare away from millions of people. So, I mean, I think he's full of shit. Like, I think he's as fake as he could possibly be. And I think a lot of people, not his own base, but I do think that a lot of people are waking up to the fact that this was just an act and they got taken for a ride.
Mm-hmm. How can we explain this historic margin of working class support for the Republican Party? This is, I think, the most troubling thing, which is that clearly Trump 1 oversaw an enormous amount of wealth polarization.
Yeah.
So why would you expect anything different? And here we are, Trump 2, and it's even worse.
Number one, I think they had a very effective strategy. You had a Democratic Party who was saying accurately, in my view, this man's an authoritarian, this man is a fascist. And then he would go on these, podcasts in the brosphere, and it made it feel like how could he be this bad? Like, he just seems like kind of a normal guy. I think that was very effective. And obviously the Biden decline and senility was a major factor. Kamala, I think, came out of the gates fairly strong with some proposals on price gouging, for example. I think the choice of Tim Walz and his approach of calling them weird instead of doing the full-blown. Again, I agree that he's a fascist, but I think sort of like mocking and deriding him was probably a more effective political strategy. And then somewhere around the DNC, I don't know if it's Mark Cuban that gets this clause into the campaign or her brother-in-law, who also was apparently very influential, but they really changed course and they dropped the weird critique. They embraced the fascist critique. They stopped talking about the price gouging. They start running around with Liz Cheney and Mark Cuban instead of Bernie Sanders. And, and I think that really marked the beginning of the decline for that campaign. You also have global factors like inflation, obviously, was a huge issue. We had lower inflation in the U.S., but it was deeply painful for a lot of people. They felt like, partly because Biden was out to lunch, they felt like this was not taken seriously by the Democratic Party, I think fairly so. And then the other thing that to me was and continues to be an undertold part of the story is the way that Biden and Harris's support for a genocide rendered them incredibly morally compromised. And so you had a lot of young people in particular who were disgusted with that. Again, I think understandably so. Trump did enough to pretend like maybe he'd be a little bit different. Obviously, we've seen how that worked out.
Right,
but,
right.
If you look at the numbers in places like Dearborn, Michigan, obviously this rhetorical sleight of hand worked for him in some respects. So when you put all those pieces together, I think that's what leads to this particular moment. There are other factors as well, but that's kind of how I see it.
What does progressive politics have to offer young men?
I mean, I think we all as human beings have care and concern for what is happening to not only in our own lives, but in the lives of those around us. Like, I think that's some part of, like, an essential part of what it means to be human. So, I don't know. I don't really love the conversation about, like, what does it have for men or what does it have for women? I think that's more universal of, a human project of trying to better the world, to try to make things a little bit better and leave them a little better for the next generation. To me, again, I think that's a foundationally human project. There's not another species that engages in that project of trying to improve things and understand things more and create, new possibilities for the next generation. So for me, that's like the bedrock of it.
Yeah, I think the week after the election, I had so many calls and media appearances about everybody had this, like, how did young men swing this far? And it's like, well, what if it's just people being proletarianized? What if they're conscious that they're falling out of the middle class and you're just watching workers swing that direction? And a lot of younger people just happen to be proletarianized at a faster rate than Gen X, for example.
Yeah.
Because young women swung 11 and just not a lot explains. Like, it's only a 4-point gap between the genders. Like,
well, it's also, if you look at, I mean, again, you're asking, like, why don't these Democratic consultants get it? Like, they also are sort of paid not to get it because all the answers are there in Zohran's run.
Yep.
I mean, look at how he did with young men.
Great turnout.
Amazing turnout. He did the thing that leftists have been dreaming about, which is he actually changed the electorate. I mean, this is what we hoped that Bernie would be able to do, and he did it, right? And that's, one of the sort of rocks that Bernie ends up crashing into. And of course, there's, conspiracy against him as well, as there is against Zohran at this point too. But he truly changed the electorate. Young people are electrified by him. But it's not just young people. I mean, you look at his support with working class people. You can also look to Bernie. Bernie he's the most popular politician, national politician in the country. And not just with, the commie corridor. He has significant, broad-based, and working class support. The exact sort of people that the Democratic Party has been bleeding and bleeding and bleeding. So it's not a mystery to figure out. It's just that if you are invested in a diametrically opposed political project, if you're paid by a politician who's invested in that project, if your rise to power had nothing to do with grassroots support and everything to do with support from a donor class, then you're going to do everything you can to close your eyes and plug your fingers in your ears to not understand what the obvious direction is to go in to, quote unquote, win back young men. If that's the demographic of concern.
Yeah. You think Zohran's going to win?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think it's over. I saw a poll, and this again is like the, vindication of Bernie's theory of politics. And I do think that it comes of this particular moment, both with Israel and Gaza, with the Democratic base being much more sort of radicalized. Jennifer Welsh of I've Had It said we should call it deprogrammed, which I actually kind of like. But in any case, I saw a poll that has him second among conservative voters. So beating both Eric Adams and Andrew Cuomo, the quote-unquote, other Democrats in the race, the conservative Democrats in the race. Zohran is beating both of them with self-identified conservative voters and moderate voters, and is cleaning up, obviously, with liberal voters. Winning overwhelmingly among Jewish voters. Like, it's just represents such a sea change and such a vindication of the political, project that we've been pursuing for years. And again, I think it is really truly born of this particular moment when you finally have a Democratic base that is also disgusted with Democratic leadership, that is also disgusted with liberal media institutions to a large degree, and is horrified by what they see, their leaders supporting in Gaza.
In reference to the audience that you have for Breaking Points, there's an enormous amount of crossover. It's a very heterogeneous audience.
Yeah.
What are some of the responses that you've gotten from people who are probably of a right-wing populist persuasion, but then find themselves aligning with you on certain issues? What degree of crossover do you see between those poles?
Between which poles?
Right and left. Right-wing populists falling in line behind left-wing policy prescriptions. Zohran's constituency, for example, with these conservative supporters.
I mean, it has varied at different times. Right now, Israel is a real glue. And my view on Israel and why I have it is very different from Sagar's and why Sagar has his views on Israel. I'm looking at this as a genocide, as a moral atrocity, as barbarism unleashed in a way that will not be contained to Gaza, putting things on the table that should never be put on the table, that I thought we, had aspirationally put to bed after World War II. Like, obviously, that was never really the case. But watching it live streamed every day and seeing the world do nothing to stop it has been eye-opening. Sagar views it through more of a realist lens. He's like, I actually meant America first. I did not mean Israel first. And he sees it as a geostrategic failure. And that's not to say he doesn't care about babies starving to death. But that's his political lens, is why is Israel even an ally at this point? What are we getting out of this relationship? And so, when we talk about Israel on the show, even though he and I have somewhat different political lenses, and sometimes we fight about those things, even in the context of Israel, but, I think all, like, the right-wing populists and the left-wing populists, like, the whole audience is somewhat aligned. Right. Yeah. Again, if you dig into these nitty-gritty questions, is it a genocide? Some of these things, there may be some divergences, but there is a real overlap there. And, it's not a surprise that the internet would be a hotbed for interest in that content also, because what we've always found is that the places where there's the greatest interest are the places that are underserved in mainstream press. So the view that you will get from Sagar and the view that you would get from me are not going to be views that you see very much on CNN or Fox News or MSNBC or in the New York Times. And so I think that is part of what has cohered our audience right now in this time. I don't do a lot of reading the comments because sometimes I do. It's not like a blanket rule. Kyle has more of a blanket rule than I do, but sometimes I will look. So I can't say, like, I know everything that the audience is thinking at all times. But I will also say, I think the Epstein situation was kind of a big deal in terms of the, independent bro
it's a tough one.
Sphere.
Yeah.
Because how are you going to be the anti-establishment guy and then you're now part of the Epstein cover-up and definitely in the files?
Right.
That's a tough one. And so even though there are polls that say people don't really care about this and hasn't really changed his poll numbers, I think it's significant because it really does expose the hollow nature, like just what a fraudster he is. It really does expose that. And it exposes this idea that, like, oh, you thought this guy he's a billionaire who surrounds himself with billionaires, who gives tax cuts to billionaires.
Yeah.
Like, you really think this guy is your populist hero? Get out of town. You really think he's going to fight the deep state, that he's anti-establishment? No. He's pulling out the chair for Netanyahu and covering up, his own name inside of the Epstein files. So these things clearly connect because of the potential intel connection with Mossad. So I do think that has also been, pretty eye-opening for a large part of the populist right. The left was already there in terms of Trump being in the Epstein files and it being, him being not the anti-establishment warrior that he portrays himself.
You mentioned before that there's a kind of mirror effect where certain political positions are underrepresented in the legacy media, so to speak.
Yeah.
There's been a number of studies that survey the alt media landscape that find it to be overwhelmingly conservative, like 90% in some of these cases. To what degree, and then important to say that 90% majority of the alt media landscape being conservative is held up as evidence of the popular consensus, that this represents the popular will in the United States.
Yeah.
To what degree is alt media conservative because legacy media is overwhelmingly Democrat?
I think that's been significant. but I think that landscape is changing rapidly. And we've seen the rise of, liberal podcasts. I was, Kyle and I actually were talking about this recently. Like I mentioned, Jennifer Welch and Angie from the I've Had It podcast. They're fierce liberals, who are pro-Palestine. They're putting up the AIPAC tracker, calling out Kirsten Gillibrand, like just not taking any shit across the board, right? And unafraid of going after Democratic leadership. But they're definitely liberals. They're not leftists.
Yeah.
And I don't think that their podcast would have taken off the way that it is. They've already surged past 1 million subs. They're getting crazy views. They're getting lots of attention. Fox News is losing their minds over them, like the whole bit.
Okay.
I don't think that would have been possible in an earlier era, because you just didn't have a sort of liberal base looking for, two ladies who look like your stereotypical wine moms for content. They're like, I have Rachel Maddow. I have, Morning Joe. I have the New York Times. I don't need to go online. So I think there is a dramatic shift that's happening right now. And you see it with them. You see it with the Midas Touch podcast. You see it with Brian Tyler Cohen. There's all sorts of new rising, growing rapidly, like liberal or left liberal creators in the space now, because I think they increasingly don't feel represented anymore either by their supposedly liberal media institutions. So, I do think it's shifting right now as we speak.
Yeah. Krystal Ball, I have immense admiration for your work.
Well,
I get my news from you.
Oh, thank you. Do you really?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure.
Thanks for listening. To watch part 2 of this episode, you can support the show on Patreon.